Welcome to the Health and Wealth podcast. Today I'm joined in the studio by Jesper Larsen of Aixial Group, a global mid-size full-service CRO and life science consultancy with lots of expertise in the area of clinical trials. Today we're going to learn a bit more about what's important to remember for an investor in life science when it comes to just clinical trials. Welcome, Jesper.
Thank you very much.
Nice to have you here.
Yeah, I'm very pleased to be here as well.
Why won't you start with telling us briefly about Aixial Group, what kind of company that is, and what it is you do?
Yeah, thank you very much. Aixial Group is a global CRO, mid-sized, with great capabilities within the EU and US especially, doing clinical studies for especially biotech companies, but also to pharma companies, of course. On top of that, we also are life science consultants, meaning that if you are as a biotech company is in need of additional resources, this is something we provide as well. So basically, it's supporting the life science industry.
Well, if we look at the drug development process, and which steps of that are Aixial Group normally involved in, and could you briefly explain the different steps?
Yeah, thank you very much. We're used in all phases within clinical development. So clinical development is from you start thinking of having a compound going into humans, which means that you have some preclinical data, and by that you have some interactions with the authorities. And based on the feedback you get there, you initiate a clinical study once you have the funding, of course. Within clinical studies, you in general do have 3 different phases. So you have phase 1, which is basically in the tens of patients. It could be between 10 and perhaps 30, 40. And the aim of that is to make sure that the compound is relatively safe to give. Then you have phase 2, which could be between 50 to 150, perhaps 250 patients. The aim is still to see whether it's safe profile, but also to see if you have any signs of efficacy. And based on these things, you can actually design your phase 3 study, and then which is in between 200 to 1,000 patients. It depends a little bit on the indication, but based on that, you design your phase 3 study, and that's where you get your end data that will need to be submitted to the authorities for approval of a compound. This is a very short explanation. The actual process are very lengthy and costly, of course. So, but in principles, this is it.
It gives a basic understanding of the different phases. So the phase 1 is for safety and making sure that people actually don't die over a compound. The second phase is to again make sure that it's safe, but also see if it works in some way. And then the phase 3, if I understand correctly, is then to sort of replicate phase 2, but with a greater number of patients to make sure that you have statistical significance then in the results. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay,
yes.
Great. So in early stage drug development, we know that drug development and developing new therapies is a risky business in many ways. Would you say that there is a certain point in the development process where you can say that, well, once you pass this step, then you really have de-risked the project?
Yeah. I don't see that there should be one specific point where you do not have a risk. There are risks all the way. From very beginning to the very end of phase 3 and until you receive the marketing authorization. The risk comes with various nature, depending on the compound, the indication, and what can I say, the overall purpose of the study and what you want to achieve in which population. So these are the main points. So no specific risk that you can say at this point. There are no risks anymore. There will always be risk, and investments in life science is, from my perspective, risky.
I think there's a general consensus about that among investors. Some investors don't even touch this area at all because they don't want to deal with that type of risk. But could you perhaps give a few examples of what kind of risks there are? I mean, like you said, there are risks all the way along, but the typical ones, like of course, if it's toxic, if it's not tolerated, that's a big risk, of course. But that's also something that you try to eliminate quite early on, I guess. But are there any other specific examples of risks?
Actually, all of the risks are trying to be eliminated. But if you look at the tox, you would risk that in preclinical studies. Later on, you have the risk of, for instance, if you have a difficult patient population, it can be very risky or difficult to find the actual patients that can enter the study. You want to be very specific when you find the patients, and that causes often that they are very difficult to find. So finding patients makes the process also a lengthy process, and that gives you, of course, shorter time on the patent, because the patent is something you receive on the compound, and you have a certain number of years from patent to end of patent, but the first usually 10 to 14 years perhaps will go to actually approve the compound for marketing authorization. So there are risks all the way.
And we're actually going to talk about the patent side of things in a completely different episode of Health and Wealth. But thanks for mentioning that as well. So an early milestone is testing if the drug candidate is safe in healthy persons. That's during the phase 1 trials then. And what are the primarily safety signals that that will reassure an investor that this is actually a product that I could continue to support in development?
There will always be risks, and the risks are associated in what you expect to see. So if you have a profile and a compound where you expect to see certain side effects, this is a part of the overall assessment of the compound. So what is especially risky is that if in case you find items that are not expected, that is a safety concern usually. And that is something that is taken very, very serious, also in order to protect the patients, which is absolute key for the development of new compounds.
And in order to start clinical trials, I believe you need to submit what's called an investigation new drug application. Are there any key factors in such an application that you should look at as an investor to sort of try to assess the potential for success in a drug?
You should have very, very comprehensive safety data before you enter an IND. The whole planning and preparation of the IND is absolute key to be allowed to start the process of a clinical study, which naturally involves patients' treatment with novel compounds as well. So there are many, many factors into the IND process, and we can only encourage investors to look at those companies that has de-risked this as much as possible.
And looking at the different phases then, or as we sometimes like to call it, the milestones that you can reach in the drug development, which of these clinical milestones would you say would normally add the most value to your company?
If you look in terms of numbers, it's naturally the phase 3 study that will add most to the value in terms of dollar value, you can say. But naturally, it's every step, every milestone is crucial in order to be allowed to go to the next step. So the actual, we can say, value of the compound goes usually hand in hand with the risk that we discussed before.
So when you come to as far as the phase 3 study, then generally you have de-risked the project more. So if you finish with the phase 3 with good results, then you have a really big value usually.
Yes, usually. But it depends, because if you have done something so your compound is not meeting its primary endpoint, then you will not meet your endpoint. And you can have a very, very good compound. You can have very good staff, found the best hospitals, the best patients that fit into this. But if the protocol is not written into that specific compound in what you want to show and achieve with the compound, you will not. It will not be approved because you will not meet your primary endpoint. And that's why it's crucial to have the right persons also to do the medical writing of the protocol. and the investigator's brochure that are key elements of the clinical development.
And you mentioned also the access to patients and to find the right patients with the right inclusion criteria and so on. Is that also something that you guys at Aixial Group take care of when you take on an assignment from a biotech company, for example?
Yes, we develop the patient recruitment strategy, and depending on the therapeutic area, it's also dependent on the strategy for that specific compound based on the company's wishes and needs. It depends very much on whether you would like to develop the compound in US, in Europe, or in both areas of the world. But yes, patient recruitment is something that is taken very serious because it's a lengthy process. And in case you cannot find the patients, then you prolong the study, and thereby you have shorter time with the marketing authorization within the patent, which is basically where you generate the income that has to pay off for the clinical development.
And so obviously then there are quite big costs involved with clinical drug development. What would you say determines the cost level in a clinical trial? Is it just the trial size, or are there any other factors?
Trial size is many things. It's actually the number of patients, it's the number of countries, it's the number of sites, meaning hospitals in each country. So these are the key factors. It's also a key factor, or there are some key factors in how complex the study is. The more complex, of course, the more costly the development is. In recent years, we've seen also some development of some very novel compounds, including radiopharmaceuticals, and they are, of course, extraordinarily expensive since it's radiation that you have within patients.
Very complicated to handle. Basically.
Very complicated to handle and very costly, because if you have no, proof of where you have the radiation, then you have big issue, and you might actually have a parts of the hospital that is closed down for a long time. So therefore, it's extremely costly. Also to handle the samples, to send it to the lab, to make sure that everyone is trained in handling radioactive material. So, but that's a small side of the oncology studies that has become increasingly important over the past year or two, perhaps.
And you mentioned that the Aixial Group is a global company with presence in many countries, and also access to sites, as you call them, or hospitals in many countries. Are there any geographical differences in terms of the costs, for example, involved with conducting a trial on sites in India versus in Europe or the US?
Yes, there are huge differences in the cost, as you also see huge differences in the cost of having a patient admitted to a hospital. These things are somewhat following, par on par. So the more expensive countries will also have more expensive development costs. There are some countries that you must go to. Let's say that you want to have an R&D within FDA for the US, then usually it's a must to go to US population, also to make sure that you cover the diversity that you have within the US, for instance. For Europe, it also differs a little bit, but mostly you would go to the countries where you would not look so much at cost because the difference is relatively small. The big 5 European countries would be usually where you would go, and then there could be some cases where you had larger prevalence of a certain disease in the northern region here in the Nordics. So we could be selected for that. It could also be that there was some cultural things, perhaps that you would be more used to be vaccinated in certain countries, and thereby you would select that country. So there are many factors to take in when you decide the feasibility of a country for a clinical study.
And you also mentioned the importance of finding the right patients and access to patients. And that can differ quite a lot, I understand, from which kind of indication you are developing the drug for. So does that also affect the costs a lot?
Yeah, absolutely. Some patients are really, really difficult to find. And as we see that you have more and more niche products or compounds that may come out, it will also be increasingly difficult to find the patients. This can also be seen with the orphan drug designation, where you find patients for rare diseases, which is a very, very good thing, because otherwise it could be difficult to find a business case around that. So you actually develop compounds for rare diseases. But in that case, you might require a larger, we can say, organization, or even on a country basis. So you have one coordinating hospital taking all the patients from that country to make sure that you get everything. For the more rare disease you get, you can usually also can use patient registries. But that is all coordinated by the hospitals, of course, because as a biotech company, you're of course not allowed to see the ID of the patients going into a clinical study.
Specific patient records are secret, basically.
Yes.
Yeah, that's important. We are dwelling a little bit on the cost side here, but that's also quite natural to talk about from an investment point of view, seeing as funding, especially the last couple of years, has been quite challenging for many companies. So it's important to keep an eye out for the costs, of course. And how could you, as an investor, then how should you, if you generalize, when a company says we need to do a study in so and so many patients, for example, is there like a general rule of thumb in how much it would cost per patient, or is it possible to generalize that way?
It's very difficult to generalize because it depends very much on the phase. It depends very much in whether the patient will have to be hospitalized. It depends very much on the indication. So there are no rule of thumb. There are, as per specific area, that could be within certain parts of oncology. It could be within certain parts of neurology. Some tests and some lab tests are extremely expensive. Scans usually also are very expensive. So I would say there are no general rule of thumb. No, not in general. But there are, of course, if you go into very specific phase 1 studies, then there's a rule of thumb of how much a patient is. There is within radiopharmaceuticals, what is the cost of a patient there. But these are very rough numbers.
Could you give sort of estimate or examples of that would be?
I'd rather not do that, actually. I would like to, but it differs so much, so it's very difficult to put in a number specifically.
Yeah, we don't want to give out misleading information here,
No,
so that's good. Better to be cautious. But then, are there any general rules as to which therapeutic areas are considered more costly than others?
Yeah. In general, you can say oncology is rather costly. Again, the radiopharmaceuticals are increasingly costly, but the more difficult and the more costly procedures that you have to do, that is a cost driver, of course, as we discussed before. And also, in case you have to go to certain countries, that could be Japan, for instance, that is also more costly than an average country. So it depends on the setup in these things.
And as you mentioned earlier, for example, then handling radiopharmaceuticals, that's more complicated and complex, so that drives costs. You said oncology in general, is that because of the way the drugs are distributed through IVs, or is it that type of thing that drives the cost there?
That's also a cost, because if you can actually, if you can prepare the actual compound, if it's IV medicine, so within something you get an injection in the arm, if you can do that at the hospital and not at the pharmacy, then usually it's cheaper. Once you have an extra department, it adds additional costs, because then it also has to be produced, that has to be released at the pharmacy, and that creates, of course, an additional cost.
Well, everything is expensive when it comes to drug development, I would say. At the end of a clinical trial, there's usually a very important event, quite binary by nature. They call it data readout, where the actual results, then the trial results, are presented. How involved, in which way are Aixial Group involved in that? And can you sort of give a short explanation of how that works?
So we're not involved in the actual communication. That happens usually with our clients or with the biotech or pharma company that we are producing the clinical data from. So data are generated at the hospital. They're being refined and cleaned by Aixial by our clinical data management group. We have statistical programmers and statisticians that actually set up the actual statistics program in designated programs for that. And thereby they will also be able to pull out the conclusion of the study. So once you have the conclusion, we hand that over to the biotech or pharma company. And then it's their job to communicate to the wider world.
And that usually happens quite straight away when they have the data they need to communicate
From an investor point, yes, then you have these communiques that is going out of the biotech company. But we should also remember that there was usually also be some kind of scientific publication behind that. And it's a must that there will be some kind of publication after you have done a clinical study. And that part is also being done by Aixial, by our medical writing group.
So the medical writers then put together that journal or the article for a journal that's peer reviewed, for example, and that's a requirement then.
Yeah, that's one of our services that we do.
Okay, and as I mentioned, the data readout or the final results of a clinical trial, that's a very binary event. It could go really, really badly, or it could be a really good result, and that will definitely affect the value of the company tremendously. But as an investor, you always want to know when you can make an exit from an investment. And are there any specific inflection points during the drug development process that could be considered then good exit points, so to speak?
It's not an area where we specifically are very engaged. It is with the biotech companies and the investors. But we do see companies that are having a risk profile, and they seem perhaps that this risk has been de-risked a lot after the phase 2. So some companies naturally, or some investors, would like to withdraw their investment after phase 2. That's what we see, at least from some of the companies that we collaborate with.
And that's what you usually call proof of concept, basically. Yeah. So they know that the stuff works, but they haven't gone into the really, really bigger or more expensive phase 3 trials yet.
No, exactly.
Okay. So how important are patient-centric is that approach? How important is that approach in clinical trial design for the possible success of a drug?
It's absolutely vital that we have the right patients in the study, and that the patients will benefit from the compound in case they can. So for the patients, there is also always a risk-benefit ratio. Does the benefit they get from the compound, is that deemed larger than the risk by participating in a clinical study?
For a risk for side effects, for example?
Yes. We should remember with all compounds, with everything, even paracetamol that you buy at the pharmacy, there are side effects, and there are known side effects. So that's something that you should also always keep in mind. The risk with development of compounds is not when you have known side effects, because these are obviously known, but it's when you have something new that adds into that, because that actually tips the balance between risk-benefit for the patient. Patient centricity is absolutely vital. We also collaborate with patient advocacy groups for rare diseases in order to maximize the number of patients that can go into a certain study. Whether we do that, it depends very much on the needs from our customer, and it depends very much on the size and the indication of the study.
So a general view, I think, at least among some investors, is that rare diseases, or orphan drug designation, as it's called, when we speak about a very rare disease that doesn't affect that many people, that's a good thing, because then you need only a smaller trial population or a smaller number of patients. Is that always a good thing?
It is definitely a good thing, because orphan drug designation allows also investors to see a business case in populations that are usually smaller than the big indications. If we look back in time, we had an issue that the majority or the large disease areas, so that could be cardiology, it could be endocrinology with diabetes, for instance, that you had a lot of clinical development and a lot of compounds in these areas, obviously because you have a very big business case because there are many patients in these areas. So this was taken into consideration by the authorities. So that would be EMA in Europe and would be FDA in the US. And then they created this orphan drug designation, which means that you can go out from a clinical study with less clinical data than you usually would have, but also sometimes with a requirement that you have follow-up data from patients that are given the compound after it has been approved.
So after it's on the market, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's what's named conditional approval. So
what can happen then? What can happen basically when you need to follow up on that?
As a company, you can be, told by the authorities to have a conditional approval, and thereby also to take in the safety data of the patients that will receive that after the conditional approval.
So you actually need to collect that data as a company. Okay.
You need to collect that data, and sometimes that also demands that the biotech company or the pharma company then hands out the actual compound or the marketed compound at that point to the patients for free.
Okay. All right. So that would be, kind of a negative thing then, seeing as it doesn't drive sales, basically.
From an investor point, you can say that. From a health point, from the patient perspective, it's a very good thing that we actually develop compounds also for rare diseases.
Very true, of course. And that there is a financial instrument to actually go into those indications with a smaller patient populations. Yeah. When it comes to clinical trials, are there any specific trends or innovations right now that investors should be aware of? Mm-hmm.
We see that we have more, medical devices that are automated. So that could be kind of a smartwatch specialized for clinical development that can measure pulse, temperature, blood pressure. And this is in very rapid development, meaning that I believe in a few years, you can actually measure a lot of vital signs with these items. They might not be as accurate as the actual thermometer or scale or what you use at the hospital, but they are so much cheaper, so you can actually add in a larger patient population. And since you have a larger patient population, then you can de-risk the actual risk that you have with these measurements. So by having more measurements, you can be more certain that you get the accurate items.
But that usually also then is related to bigger amounts of data, and that's usually when people start talking about AI, because AI can handle a lot of data. Is AI something to look forward to within clinical trials as well?
AI is already within clinical trials. That could be within feasibility for selecting the hospitals and the countries that you go into. It could also be within data management. So let's say you have some data that are looking strange. Today you have some automated programs run by a data manager. In the future, it may be AI program that is running that. I know that the authorities is looking very closely into that, and we're of course following that very, very closely to see when we have some directions in that area. But it's already used in certain parts of clinical development.
So, reflecting on your experience and with all of Aixial Group's expertise backing you up, what key piece of advice would you give to an investor then who's new to drug development and investing in companies that do that?
Be very much aware about the risks. As an investor, it is a risky area. It can also be a very rewarding area. It's also rewarding in terms of the patients that will have new treatment. But be very much aware of the risk. Be very much aware of the potential benefits that this can give to a certain patient population. That is absolutely key. Like any investment, that you do a very thorough research in what you're investing in.
Well, it's been great picking your mind and learning a lot. So thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you very much for being here.